This image of Stonehenge is done in silverpoint on an almost absolutely white ground, prepared ground, and it's based on the first photograph taken of Stonehenge, which was the first really well-documented photograph, 1873. And the reason I did the drawing was to just deal with that transition, if you will, from photography to a silverpoint medium, because they're very, very interconnected in terms of their technicalities. And it's a way for me to kind of explore how finite silverpoint as a medium can be. And then the second image, this image of the bridges in Verona, is a silverpoint study with a slightly different silverpoint methodology, where the surface itself is toned and prepared, and then the silverpoint drawing is built up application after application after application, because each time you apply the silverpoint instrument, it takes a few days for the silver to react with its prepared ground to show you how it's going to work. Because this medium is very different than drawing as we know it. It's entirely dependent on the prepared ground that you work the tool on. So silverpoint, unlike other drawing methods, metal point is the over category of the whole thing, is dependent on two things. The instrument itself, which is a nice classic example of one right here. It's about an 1/8" diameter silver rod. It's called 999 dead soft silver, although the silver can be other than that. Response is a little different. Here's a piece of cardboard, and here's just one layer of silverpoint ground, prepared ground on it. Now notice that when I run this instrument across the cardboard, there's a little dragging and marking, but then when it gets to the prepared ground, you can see that the instrument is depositing silver onto the prepared ground, and this is actually how the silverpoint textures are developed. Seemingly very simple, but what's interesting about them is that they don't clog up. And it's not like working with a graphite pencil, and if you had phenomenal eyesight, you would even see that there's separation between all those little lines that I built that up with. And what happens when you do that, number one, it's recorded in a very clean and a complete way on the ground. And then secondly, when you have a drawing like this, it has a depth that is very, very similar to photography. And as a matter of fact, it's kind of related to a silver palladian print. So let me just show you 2 or 3 or 4 images done with silverpoint. And this was done with a very similar technique. This is onto a white, almost white field. And the way this is done, this is another very traditional way of doing things. You take a clean piece of paper and you, with a watercolor brush, you locate just where things are going to go on this page. And then you put that page down on the ground, you wipe the back of it with a sponge, and you throw the piece of paper away, the top piece, and you're left with these little tiny trace areas that are on the drawing. And it gives you a guide to find the drawing, if you will, because every mark that goes down onto the prepared ground is there permanently. You can't really remove it, and you can't erase. You can paint over it a little, but it's detectable. It's a very different medium, and it's this balance between what this instrument is doing and the surface it's doing it on. That makes it a very unique kind of drawing process. Now, let's move to another, yeah, here we go. This is good. Suppose the surface was very textured and very responsive and built up, like an impressionist painting or modern painting. Now, here is this image of this fish. And this is an interesting thing. All of this texture and graininess in here, which sort of suggests tissue, if you will, was built up ahead of time by the brush itself, putting the material down, and then carved into it. So it's almost a like a technique of knife painting and then putting the silver point medium over it, okay? So it's kind of a building up of that. Then in this instance, it's on a toned board, these two bird feet here, and this board also has a texture. And if you came in really close, you could see the texture, the undertexture of the drawing itself. A lot of those little swoopy lines and so forth, which makes it look like it's some sort of magical hand-built paper, are just the product of how the material was brushed on to prepare the ground, and then the drawing was done on the ground itself. And you can see the edge of the ground right there, okay? Now here is a prepared ground, all ready to go. It's got a little texture to it, and it's almost white. The color range with silver point is not absolute white, absolute black. It's somewhere in the middle. It's maybe Munsell 3 to Munsell 8. And so the colored ground, it's not a good idea, I don't think, to have the ground be bone white either. Now let's just start working away, you know, with the ground underneath. Let's see. Well, we'll start like this. Okay. We'll do a. What you can do with silver point is the lines are so fine that you can adapt them into what you're doing and then build up a little later. You see, I'm sketching on this just as if it was regular paper, but it's not. And there's a lot of little textured areas, like up here. You see, that's going to pick up that texture that's underneath it. And the instrument you use, of course, it has to be shaped to do this. Now this is a smaller diameter silver wire, slightly harder than the dead soft wire. And you can see that the tones you develop are fairly clean because they have little air spaces in between them. They're not built up masses of graphite. So you can see how that starts to. So that's how quickly the drawing can be developed. And then after a few days, this silver that's on here will change color slightly, and you can go back in again and continue to modify and develop the drawing. So let's look at another. Now here's another technique that can be used, which I think is kind of interesting. This drawing originally was just cut out of my sketchbook, see? And then I mounted it on a board carefully, and then painted it out with this silverpoint ground. And then the drawing itself was a sketch I did in studio of the model. It's this kind of landscape-ish kind of form, but it's typical of a studio drawing. And then I washed it off, I washed it back, and then built up the ground right over the original drawing. And then, because I had the prepared ground over the drawing, I was able to rework the whole drawing completely in silverpoint. So I'll just go way over to the edge of the drawing here, which will probably be covered up by the mat when it's actually mounted. And you can see, if you can get right in there, you can see how the silverpoint is actually being picked up by the ground, whereas right over here on the paper, it's not. Because it's always the relationship of this little instrument and the ground itself.